The early morning sun cast a golden hue over the quiet suburban street, painting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns. Birds chirped from treetops, and the air still held the cool bite of dawn. In the driveway of a modest single-story home, John and Melissa Parker were loading the back of their weathered green pickup truck with the final bits of camping gear. The truck, though aged and a bit rusty around the wheel wells, had been their companion on dozens of weekend getaways. Its bed was filled with a neatly rolled-up tent, 2 sleeping bags, a cooler, a foldable table, and a worn duffel bag filled with clothes and supplies. John, tall and broad-shouldered with a weekend stubble on his face, was double-checking the checklist he always kept in his back pocket. He was methodical and cautious, the kind of man who preferred being overprepared to being caught off guard. Melissa, with sun-kissed hair pulled into a loose braid, leaned into the passenger seat and arranged a small snack bag filled with granola bars, apples, and a couple of sandwiches. She was the spontaneous one, always pushing for new trails, new vistas, and new stories to bring home. Together, they balanced each other perfectly, him with the structure, her with the spark. Their 10-year-old son, Ethan, stood on the porch in his pajamas, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He held his favorite stuffed animal in one hand and a glass of orange juice in the other. He watched his parents with a mix of admiration and quiet disappointment. He had wanted to go with them this time, he always wanted to go, but this particular trip was, just for the two of us, as his mom had explained the night before. "We need a little grown-up adventure," she had said, kissing the top of his head. "But we'll be back in 2 days, and next time, you're definitely coming." Ethan didn't fully understand why he couldn't go. He was old enough to help with the firewood, smart enough to stay away from snakes, and brave enough, at least he thought so. Still, he said nothing, just stood there watching as his dad secured the bungee cords across the tailgate. John caught sight of Ethan and smiled warmly. "Hey, champ," he called out. "Take care of the place while we're gone, all right?" Ethan nodded and managed a small smile. Melissa came over to him, bent down, and gave him a long hug. She smelled faintly of coffee and sunscreen. "We'll be back before you know it," she whispered. "You and Aunt Claire are going to have fun, I promise." The sound of tires crunching gravel signaled the arrival of his aunt, who pulled up in a silver sedan, waving cheerfully from behind the wheel. She stepped out, gave John a quick hug and Melissa a kiss on the cheek. "Got your route planned?" she asked John. "Yeah, taking the Old Basin Trail. Should be nice and quiet," he said. "We'll have reception the first few hours. After that, off the grid." Ethan didn't know what "off the grid" meant exactly, but it sounded exciting and mysterious. He watched as his dad climbed into the driver's seat and his mom buckled in beside him. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. Melissa rolled down her window and blew Ethan a kiss. John gave one last wave. And just like that, the truck pulled away, rounding the corner and disappearing into the growing morning light. It would be the last time Ethan saw them. The air felt heavier than usual inside the small-town police station. It had only been 2 days since John and Melissa Parker were supposed to return from their weekend camping trip, but their son, Ethan, already knew something wasn't right. He sat stiffly on a plastic chair in the corner of the room, swinging his legs nervously, clutching a crumpled photograph of his parents smiling during their last family barbecue. His Aunt Claire stood at the counter, speaking with an officer, her voice tight with worry but trying to remain calm for Ethan's sake. The officer behind the desk, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a badge that read, "Deputy Miller," scribbled notes on a yellow pad as Claire explained the situation. "They left Friday morning. John told me they'd be back Sunday evening. No calls, no texts, nothing. I called their phones. Straight to voicemail. It's not like them." Deputy Miller nodded slowly. "And they mentioned where they were headed. Somewhere near Basin Trail," Claire said. John said it was out past Route 47, near the old logging roads. "He's gone there before, but this time feels different. They always call if they're running late." In the corner, Ethan's eyes darted around the room, taking in the bulletin board plastered with flyers, wanted posters, and a faded, "community barbecue" announcement from 2 summers ago. It all felt unreal. He'd expected them to walk through the door the night before, laughing about running out of marshmallows or showing him photos of wildflowers and desert canyons. But the night had come and gone with no headlights in the driveway, no keys in the door, no parents. Deputy Miller rose from his seat and gestured toward a younger officer nearby. "Dispatch a search team up toward Basin Trail. Let's notify the Forest Service, too. It's remote, but we'll cover what we can." He turned back to Claire. "We'll treat this as a missing persons case for now, but try not to panic. Maybe they ran into car trouble or lost signal." Claire nodded, though her eyes were filled with dread. She sat next to Ethan and wrapped an arm around him. "They're just stuck, that's all," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. "They're probably trying to hike out right now." The next 48 hours passed in a blur of search efforts, phone calls, and growing fear. A team of volunteers was assembled, friends, neighbors, local hikers who knew the desert trails well. Helicopters buzzed low over the canyon ridges while police vehicles rumbled along dirt roads, sending up clouds of dust in the scorching July heat. Reporters began gathering near the outskirts of town, cameras rolling as the story spread. "Local couple missing after camping trip," one news anchor announced in a live broadcast. Footage showed the Parker home, the now empty driveway, and Ethan's school portrait pulled from an old yearbook. Inside Claire's house, Ethan sat on the living room couch, watching the news replay the same images over and over. He didn't fully grasp the seriousness of it, but he felt the change in the room, the way the adults whispered when he walked in, the way Claire stayed glued to her phone, pacing endlessly, barely eating. The silence at night was the worst. No laughter, no stories, just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the wall clock. On the fourth day, a ranger found tire tracks leading off an unmarked path near Basin Trail, but they ended abruptly near a dry wash, as if the vehicle had simply vanished. There were no signs of a campsite. No footprints. No gear. The mood shifted from hope to uncertainty. Something didn't add up. And while the official search continued, somewhere deep in his heart, Ethan knew they weren't just lost. They were gone. Time passed, as it always does, but for Ethan Parker, every day without his parents felt like a ripple in a still, quiet lake, widening, stretching, never fading. After the search was called off, the world seemed to move on without them. News cameras left, volunteers returned to their lives, and officials closed the missing persons file with a cold note, presumed dead, unresolved. But for Ethan, nothing was resolved. He was 11 years old, suddenly an orphan, clinging to fading memories of two people who had walked out the door one summer morning and never came back. He stayed with Aunt Claire, who did her best to raise him with love and structure. Her home became his new normal, a place with different furniture, different smells, and a quietness he never quite got used to. Claire kept their photos up around the house. She never stopped talking about John and Melissa, never let Ethan forget them, but she also encouraged him to live. "You've got a life ahead of you," she'd say gently. "They'd want you to live it fully." Ethan went through the motions. School, homework, birthdays with a single candle and polite smiles. But something inside him refused to let go. While other kids grew up dreaming about cars or college or careers, Ethan thought about maps. About desert roads. About abandoned trails and dry washes. He filled notebooks with sketches of Nevada's terrain, studied old Forest Service reports, watched videos of hikers exploring areas near Basin Trail. Every year on the anniversary of their disappearance, he'd sit alone in his room with his dad's compass and the journal Melissa used to write poetry in, both of which had been left behind at home. As he grew into his teenage years, the pain dulled but never disappeared. It hardened into a quiet determination. He didn't talk much about his parents with friends. When someone asked, what happened to them, he'd shrug and say, they went camping and never came back. That was enough to silence most. Ethan learned skills his parents would have been proud of. He joined a local hiking club, then an amateur survival group. He learned how to track, how to navigate with a compass and the stars, how to interpret satellite images and read the land like a story. He saved up money from part-time jobs to buy a used drone, which he flew over remote areas whenever he could. He subscribed to missing persons forums, even anonymously posted photos and descriptions, hoping someone, anyone, might stumble upon something useful. By the time Ethan was 21, he had become quiet, introspective, and methodical, more like his father than he ever realized. His childhood room had transformed into a mini research lab, its walls covered in maps, pins, and string-connecting theories. He didn't believe in closure, not really, but he believed in answers. Somewhere out there, the desert still held a secret, and he intended to find it. There were moments of doubt. Days where he looked at the vast emptiness of the maps and felt overwhelmed by how small he was. 11 years was a long time. Too long. The truck could have been buried in sand, washed away, scavenged. But then he'd remember the sound of his mother's laugh or the way his father always triple-checked their camping gear, and the doubt would vanish. They wouldn't have given up on him. So he wouldn't give up on them. One night, alone in the dark, Ethan stared at an updated satellite image on his computer screen, high-resolution terrain scans of a section of desert just south of where the official search had ended. And there, barely visible under layers of sand and scrub, was something that didn't belong. A rectangular shape, rust-colored, just enough to catch his breath. His heart pounded. His hands shook. After 11 years, he might have found them. Ethan stared at the satellite image for hours, barely blinking. The shape was small, almost indistinguishable from the desert terrain around it, just a faded rectangle half buried in a wash near the edge of an unmarked trail. But something about it gnawed at him. It was the right size. The right color. And it was in the right kind of place, remote, forgotten, the kind of area a truck could end up if it veered off course or took a wrong turn 11 years ago. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was more than he'd ever had. He leaned closer to the screen, pulling up historical satellite comparisons. The shape hadn't been there in images from the years immediately following the disappearance, but it began to appear faintly around 5 or 6 years ago, possibly exposed by shifting sands or the erosion of the desert floor. It was the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice. But Ethan had trained himself to see what others missed. He scribbled notes furiously, marking GPS coordinates, cross-referencing nearby landmarks, checking old ranger logs and off-road vehicle maps. This location had barely been touched during the original search effort. It was just beyond the radius they had prioritized, a few miles too far, a few degrees off from the path his parents were believed to have taken. That margin of error might have made all the difference. Sleep was out of the question. He spent the entire night gathering gear, water, rations, a first aid kit, compass, batteries, portable GPS, and the drone with spare propellers. The next morning, without telling anyone, he packed everything into his car and drove. The desert opened up before him like a vast, sun-scorched ocean. Endless miles of dry, cracked earth, jagged hills, and wind-swept ridges. His tires kicked up clouds of dust as he left the pavement behind, following a series of barely their service roads and old tire tracks that hadn't seen a vehicle in years. The summer heat pressed down on him like a weight, baking the windshield and making the horizon shimmer with mirages. But he didn't turn back. He navigated carefully, stopping frequently to consult his GPS and double-check the printed satellite maps he had brought. Every bump in the road sent jolts through his spine, every dip and rise in the landscape made him wonder if he was getting closer, or just chasing a shadow. By late afternoon, he reached the spot where the road dissolved into a series of narrow ravines and dry creek beds. He parked the car under the thin shade of a stunted mesquite tree and continued on foot, the heat radiating off the rocks like a furnace. His boots crunched over gravel and sand, his shirt clung to his back, and the only sound was the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. Finally, after hours of hiking, he reached the rise that overlooked the shallow basin where the object had appeared in the satellite images. He stopped at the top, heart pounding. The world felt silent, still. He raised his binoculars and scanned the wash below. There it was. A rusted, sand-covered silhouette, just barely visible between scrub bushes. The shape of a truck. His parents' truck. The roof was caved in slightly, the windshield cracked and dusty, but the green paint, though faded, was unmistakable. Ethan stood frozen. The weight of 11 years collapsed onto him all at once, grief, relief, shock. His legs gave out, and he sank to his knees, trembling. He had found it. After all the searching, the maps, the doubts, he was finally here. But the truck was only the beginning. Now he had to find out what happened. Ethan stood at the edge of the ridge, the desert wind whispering through the brittle brush around him. The sun hovered low in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the basin below. The truck lay still, half sunken into the earth, like some ancient skeleton preserved by time. Its frame was faded, the once vibrant green dulled to a dusty olive, patches of rust eating through the metal like slow-growing wounds. The roof was warped, the front windshield webbed with fractures. From a distance, it looked abandoned. Forgotten. But Ethan knew better. He slowly made his way down the slope, every footstep deliberate, careful not to disturb the sand more than necessary. His heart pounded in his chest, not just from the physical exertion, but from the storm of emotion building inside him. Each step brought him closer to something he had imagined 1,000 times but never truly expected to find. As he reached the vehicle, he stopped a few feet away and stared. For a long moment, he couldn't move. The truck looked exactly as he remembered it, the old bumper sticker of the Grand Canyon on the rear, the chipped corner of the license plate, the bent radio antenna. All details etched in memory from a childhood that had been frozen in time. But now those memories stood in front of him, real and weathered and solid. He stepped closer, brushing a layer of dust off the driver's side door. The handle resisted at first but gave way with a loud creak. The door swung open slowly, releasing a waft of hot, dry air that smelled of age, sand, and metal. Inside, the cab was coated in a fine layer of grit. The seats were cracked from sun damage, the fabric brittle and faded. On the dashboard sat a pair of sunglasses, his father's, he was sure, and in the cup holder, a travel mug, the kind his mom always brought on trips filled with herbal tea. His hand trembled as he reached in and gently picked up the mug. The design was still there, a faded print of mountain peaks and pine trees. The same mug she'd used for years. He turned it over in his hands like a relic, a message from the past. He climbed halfway inside, trying to keep his breathing steady. In the glove compartment, he found a folded map of the area with a red pen marking their intended route. Next to it, a small leather-bound notebook. Melissa's handwriting danced across the pages, packing lists, hiking plans, reminders. On the last page, dated July 12, 2014, a final entry, stopped for the night near the ravine. Truck overheated again. John thinks it's the radiator. No signal. Might walk out in the morning. Hoping it cools down overnight. Ethan sat back, the journal pressed to his chest. He could almost hear her voice reading it to him. He stepped away from the truck, scanning the surrounding area. A few feet behind the vehicle, half buried beneath rocks and sand, he found the remains of a makeshift fire pit, blackened stones in a circle, scorched earth beneath. A tattered tarp was tangled in a creosote bush, flapping slightly in the breeze. Scattered nearby were bits of old gear, a metal pan, a broken lantern, what looked like a weather-worn backpack. There was no sign of his parents' bodies, no obvious remains. But he saw something else. Leading away from the truck, faint impressions in the dirt, half erased by time and wind. Footsteps. 2 sets, side by side, heading toward a narrow canyon nearby. Ethan stood there, staring at those tracks, the desert silent around him. They hadn't stayed with the truck. They'd tried to find help. And maybe, just maybe, the desert hadn't claimed them right away. There was more to uncover. More to understand. But for the first time in 11 years, Ethan wasn't just chasing ghosts. He was following their trail. Ethan stood in the fading light, his gaze fixed on the faint trail of footsteps leading away from the truck. The desert wind had softened their edges, worn them down over years of sun and sand, but the pattern was unmistakable, 2 sets of prints, walking side by side. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. His parents hadn't simply vanished. They had tried to survive. They had walked away from their only shelter, possibly in search of help, believing they'd find a way back. Somehow, knowing this made their absence feel more human, more real. Less like a ghost story. More like a tragedy in slow motion. He marked the direction of the tracks, careful not to step over them. The canyon ahead narrowed into a dry wash, with steep, jagged walls of sandstone on either side. As he followed the trail deeper into the passage, the temperature dropped slightly, the cliffs providing brief relief from the relentless desert heat. The silence was overwhelming. No traffic. No birds. Just the crunch of his boots and the occasional whisper of wind slipping between the rocks. A few hundred feet in, he found the first real clue, a discarded water bottle wedged between 2 stones, its plastic brittle and faded. The label was almost gone, but he recognized it. His mom always reused the same brand, claiming it fit better in their cooler. Next to it, half buried under gravel, was a shredded piece of fabric, faded red and sun-bleached almost white. He picked it up carefully. It looked like it had once been part of a shirt. Farther in, the path became steeper. He scrambled over a pile of boulders and slid down into a natural basin where flash floods had carved out shallow depressions in the rock. Here, something caught his eye, an unnatural shape wedged under an overhang. He crouched and reached for it, brushing away years of dust and sediment. It was a backpack, torn, discolored, and nearly falling apart, but still intact enough to recognize. The initials, J.P., were stitched into the inside flap, his father's. Ethan's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were scraps of what used to be a first aid kit, an empty canteen, a flashlight with corroded batteries, and a small, water-damaged notebook. Most of the pages were unreadable, but one entry had survived, written in shaky handwriting, "We're losing daylight. No signal. Melissa's leg is worse. Can't carry on much longer. If anyone finds this, please tell Ethan we tried." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the chest. He sat back hard against the canyon wall, holding the notebook to his chest, eyes brimming with tears. For the first time in 11 years, he had his father's final words. They had been scared, yes, but they hadn't given up. They had fought, together, until they couldn't anymore. He rose slowly, scanning the area. The terrain here was dangerous, uneven, with loose rocks and signs of past floods. It would have been treacherous, especially for someone injured. Melissa's leg. The note said it was getting worse. Maybe she'd fallen. Maybe they had sought shelter nearby. Ethan explored the surrounding ledges and alcoves, checking every shadowed crevice. Then, behind a large slab of rock, he found it, a small overhang, just big enough for two people to crawl under. Inside, tucked among the stones, were more remnants, a torn scarf, bones bleached by the sun, and a pair of shoes placed neatly side by side. Time had done its work, but Ethan knew. This was where they had rested. Where they had stayed, together, until the end. He sank to his knees in the dust, overwhelmed by a wave of grief and peace. After all the years, all the questions, he finally had an answer. They hadn't been lost. They had simply waited too long for help that never came. Ethan stood silently at the edge of the overhang, staring at the final resting place of his parents. The sun had begun to dip below the canyon walls, casting long shadows that crept across the stone like the slow march of time itself. The remains were scattered, gently, almost respectfully, as if nature had done its best to preserve what it could. The shoes still facing outward. The scarf, though torn and weathered, still curled in the same way Melissa always tied it. The bones, pale and worn, lay undisturbed, touched only by wind, time, and now, Ethan. His discovery was no longer just personal. He knew he couldn't leave this place unreported. After a moment to collect himself, Ethan stepped outside the alcove, pulled out his satellite phone, something he had packed for emergencies, and dialed the local sheriff's department. His voice, steady but cracked with emotion, delivered a message he had dreamed of saying for over a decade. "This is Ethan Parker, I found them." The next 24 hours unfolded like a slow, solemn ritual. Authorities arrived by helicopter early the next morning, their boots crunching against the rocky terrain as they approached the site with a kind of reverent caution. Search and rescue personnel, forensic investigators, and a medical examiner, all worked under the weight of silence, moved by the story that had haunted the area for years. The mystery of John and Melissa Parker, once just a file number, now had its ending. Ethan stood aside as they secured the area with yellow tape, documenting everything with photos and notes. A pair of cadaver dogs confirmed what Ethan already knew: no other remains were nearby. No third party. No signs of foul play. Just the harshness of the desert, an overheated engine, a missed turn, and a walk for help that ended in heartbreak. The medical examiner examined the bones with care, confirming they likely belonged to a male and female of approximate ages matching John and Melissa. They would need time for full DNA confirmation, but there was no doubt in anyone's mind. Their identities were written in every thread, every object, every word left behind. As the remains were gently gathered into body bags and airlifted from the canyon, Ethan watched with dry eyes. He had cried all his tears the day before. Now he felt something different, an aching calm. Not closure exactly, but certainty. The story no longer ended with a question mark. Detectives approached him briefly to ask about the journal entries, the location of the truck, and what had led him to this exact spot. He explained his years of searching, his work with satellite imaging, the patterns he had studied until something finally stood out. They listened with quiet admiration. One deputy, an older man who had worked on the original case years ago, gently placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder and said, "You did what none of us could. You brought them home." News of the discovery spread quickly. Within hours, headlines filled local and national feeds. Missing couple found after 11 years, son's search leads to desert discovery. Reporters gathered outside the sheriff's office, asking for statements. Ethan declined interviews. This wasn't a victory. It wasn't a story to exploit. It was an ending, a final chapter to a personal story of love, loss, and a quiet, unbreakable determination. Back at the truck, now being examined and photographed, Ethan placed a small, framed photo of the three of them on the cracked dashboard. The photo had traveled with him through every search, every dead-end lead. In it, they were smiling, arms wrapped around each other during a camping trip long before that final one. He left it there as a tribute, a sign that someone had come, someone had cared, and someone had never given up. Then, with one last glance at the canyon, Ethan turned and began the slow walk back to the waiting rescue team, the wind at his back and the weight in his heart finally beginning to lift. The sun was beginning its descent, casting a warm amber glow across the desert landscape as Ethan stood once more at the edge of the basin. The same ridge where he had first spotted the truck now offered a panoramic view of everything that had come to light: his parents' final journey, the place they had camped, and the quiet trail that led to the canyon where their story had ended. The air was still, heavy with the scent of sagebrush and dust, and for the first time in years, the silence felt peaceful, not hollow. He walked slowly back toward the truck, which now sat unguarded, its examination complete. Yellow evidence markers had been removed, and the vehicle was scheduled to be airlifted out the next day. But for now, it remained where it had been for over a decade, weathered and broken, yet somehow dignified in its stillness. Ethan approached the passenger side and gently placed a small bundle on the dashboard. Inside it were three things: his mother's journal, a pressed wildflower he had picked on the way back from the canyon, and the final photograph of the three of them together, smiling, young, unaware of what the future held. He closed the door with a soft thud and stepped back. For years, he had lived with questions that never had answers. Why had they never called? Had they been scared? Did they give up? But now, all those questions had transformed into something else, not answers, but understanding. They hadn't abandoned him. They hadn't disappeared into nothing. They had tried. They had fought. They had faced the impossible, side by side, the way they always did. Ethan walked a few yards away and sat on a flat rock, pulling out his notebook. For the first time since he was a teenager, he wrote a letter. Not to investigators. Not to search teams or online forums. But to his parents. "I found you," he wrote. "I didn't know if I ever would. Sometimes I thought I was chasing ghosts. Sometimes I thought I was just trying to fill the hole you left behind. But you were always there, on every map, in every step I took into the desert. I think I understand now. You didn't give up. You didn't want to leave me. You just got lost, like people sometimes do. But I came. I kept going. I love you. I always have. I always will." He folded the letter and tucked it into a crevice on the side of the truck, pressing it between the rusted metal and a patch of sunbaked mud. It would stay there, part of the desert now, part of their story. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the canyon was bathed in soft purples and oranges. Shadows grew long, and the world began to cool. Ethan stood in silence, letting the desert embrace him. There were no words left to say. Just a sense of quiet, of peace. Of something finished, but never forgotten. Behind him, a light breeze kicked up, rustling the dry brush, gently nudging the door of the truck until it creaked slightly and settled again. It felt like a whisper. A goodbye. Ethan turned, gave the vehicle one last look, and began the walk back to the ridge. His footsteps were steady. He no longer felt like the boy who had lost everything. He was the man who had found them. As he reached the top of the ridge and the last light of day stretched across the sky, he paused and looked out over the landscape. The desert, once a place of silence and mystery, now felt like sacred ground.